So today we're talking about a subject that I myself don't quite understand, so-called Supercity Clusters. So what I will do, I won't make any opinions first, and then I'll let the two experts have their own PowerPoints, and then we'll talk about it. Yes. So who will go first? I think Michael will go first.
Okay, great. From the background you'd see in the program, you might wonder sort of why I'm up here. But actually, in Enright, Scott & Associates, we spent a huge amount of our time looking at the combination of economic development, policy development, and business strategy in China. And we don't look at small ticket issues, we look at big ticket issues. And in China, that means real estate, it means urban development. So in China, we do about half of our work for private sector, mostly private sector developers, and the other half of our work for local governments on their economic development strategy. So it gives us a sort of an interesting perspective. I'll give an introduction to some of the concepts around the city clusters and then focus in on the Greater Bay Area. I just finished a big project on that. If you look at why this sort of city cluster program, and in part it's to overcome obstacles, and in part it's to create advantages. And in many ways, it's good that this session follows a session talking about 40 years of economic reform and development in China. Because in many ways, the city cluster policy and program is another step in China's reform and development process. Those of you who have been coming to major Chinese cities for a long time remember that in the old days, it didn't matter if you parachuted into a Chinese city, it didn't matter where you landed. It all looked the same. Because in the old command economy days, there were no differentiated cities, everything looked the same. Now we see, of course, in Shanghai, other major Chinese cities, huge developments that have gone on. In many ways, the city cluster program and project is the idea of doing the same thing over a much larger geographic area. Historically in China, just as it used to be each part of each city was supposed to be self-sufficient, each city was supposed to be self-sufficient. And so historically, there was very little market integration. Each city was its own independent market. And on top of that, because the city revenues are driven by business taxes, everybody tried to grab the same industries. So in many ways, the city cluster program and policy is designed to overcome some of the traditional disadvantages that actually date from the old days of the command economy that we're coming out of after 40 years. Right, China's had huge success, but at least on one dimension, if you look at the OECD's measurement of countries in terms of their openness to inward investment, after 40 years, China ranks 65 out of 68 in terms of the countries that are looked at. So one part of the story is a continuation of the opening, reform, development, marketization. The other half is all about creating advantages. It's about looking at cities, in many cases, cities that are close together, in some cases, large cities closer together in China than you see anywhere else in the world, and trying to figure out how to leverage the advantages through labor pooling, through division of labor, through connecting up the infrastructure, through increased specialization, etc. And this has happened in some parts of China more than others. Okay? As I talk, again, remember, and those of you, most of you actually are familiar with this, excuse me, that there's sort of a physics of city development and of city cluster development. Right? 1 hour is an easy commute. 2 hours is easy, regular face-to-face meetings. 3 hours, you get up in the morning, you get out, spend 2/3 of a day, you still get back home. 5 to 7 hours, you can do even integrated supply chains within that. Right? So keep track, again, of the timing. There's a physics. China's city cluster program includes 19 city clusters, very different types. These 19 clusters combined account for roughly 2/3 of China's GDP. And Albert indicated, we're going to talk about super city clusters. Basically, those are the Beijing-Tianjin-Hebei cluster, the Shanghai plus parts of Zhejiang, Jiangsu, and Anhui province, where we are here, and then the Greater Bay Area, which is down Hong Kong, Macau, and parts of Guangdong province. Now, together, those three superclusters account for only 3% of China's landmass, but roughly 36% of China's GDP. And those have been the leading portions of China's economy since the opening and reform process began. So when we look at the city clusters, 19, there's huge differences. Right? The Greater Bay Area, GBA, is very, very tight, as we'll see in a couple of minutes. Nowhere else in the world do we have Hong Kong, 7+ million people, Shenzhen, 12, 13 million people, Dongguan, 9, 10 million people, Guangzhou, 17 million people or more, all within about an hour and a half of each other. Nowhere else in China, nowhere else in the world. Here in the Yangtze River Delta, it's a much larger cluster in terms of geography, GDP, etc., but it's more spread out, it's more diffuse, and sort of within the overall Yangtze River Delta area, we're going to see subclusters where a lot of the action is. Then there are some that are in the program, like the Chongqing-Chengdu corridor, that are really sort of too separate. They really aren't going to function as city clusters, really, because the distances are too great and there's sort of nothing in between. Okay, so I just want to get across the point that there's a huge variety that's going on. Now, some people ask me, will this city cluster program work? And the answer is yes. Because basically, the idea is to create the infrastructure, transportation, if it's not there, coordinate policies, explore the interaction, and as long as that happens, there's going to be economic activity, there's going to be further development, right? So they will work, but the question is, what's the magnitude going to be? What's the impact going to be? Okay, as I mentioned before, Greater Bay Area, Yangtze River Delta, completely different scales. And in fact, in the Greater Bay Area, the vast majority of the economic activity is in the corridor Hong Kong to Guangzhou. The western part of the Delta, by comparison, is virtually empty and has much smaller economies, and that we expect will change with the increased connectivity down from Guangzhou, but also across the Hong Kong-Macau-Zhuhai Bridge, the connection of Hong Kong to the Chinese high-speed rail system, and then additional bridges and additional connections that are going to go across. On the other hand, here in the Yangtze River Delta, much larger area, much larger GDP, but much more spread out. Right, to get to Nanjing is 300 kilometers. To get to Hangzhou, it's 220 kilometers. And there's obviously less you can do at that sort of distance. So a lot of the, for example, development around Nanjing in terms of developing the city clusters is Nanjing further integrating with 6 other cities right around Nanjing. That's 66,000 square kilometers. That's already larger than the entire Greater Bay Area. Okay? So again, differences, different scales, different things you can do across the different regions. I'll focus now a bit on the Greater Bay Area, although many of these things will also come into play in the other super city clusters as well. When we look at the opportunities going forward, it's pretty straightforward, actually. In terms of each of the cities and their economic development, there's the economic size and the growth of the region as a whole. There's greater connectivity. That's happening in each of the major city clusters, dramatic improvements in transportation. There are the policies and programs. There's been historically a lot of talk about economic integration within these city clusters, but it's only within the last 2 years that the central government has created small leading groups and put in charge of these leading groups a member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo of the People's Republic of China. In other words, now we're serious about this, okay? And all of the regions understand that. There's, again, the sort of economic opening, particularly in the GBA, and variety and division of labor, which is actually much more developed in the GBA than in the other clusters, at least so far. In terms of the economy in the GBA, in US dollars, it's about $1.5 trillion US dollars. If you want to compare that, it would be number 12 in the world. It'd be where South Korea is, roughly. And what's interesting is that there's no single city that dominates. These days, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou have GDPs that are almost the same. They're just south of 340 billion US dollars. And this gives the region three really leaders to pull the rest of the region along. Then there's Foshan and Dongguan, traditional manufacturing centers between 100 and 150 billion, and then everybody else is 50 to 75 billion. So we can see that, again, it's the Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Dongguan, Guangzhou corridor that absolutely dominates in the GBA so far. If we look at what's going on in terms of connectivity, there's new connectivity at multiple levels. In the GBA, we're seeing expansions of the airports in Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, a new airport being developed in Foshan, and the international connectivity of this region is the best in China. Historically, with regard to the rest of the Chinese mainland, this area was peripheral, not only geographically, but also from the transport standpoint. That is being rectified, although it will never be as central as we are here in the Yangtze River Delta. And then within the GBA itself, massive connectivity improvements in just the last few years. And I'll give you an example, sorry being Hong Kong-centric. In 2010, I took my team, gave them a bunch of cash, and said, get as far as you can from Central in Hong Kong in 1, 2, and 3 hours. And the 2010 diagram is how far they could get. We gave people a prize for the furthest away from Central. And this was generally by train, car, taxi, whatever they could do. In 2018, after the opening of the XRL, the opening of the Hong Kong-Macau-Zhuhai Bridge, this was a diagram where you can see around the high-speed rail stations, you can get pretty far. You can get to the Huizhou station. In fact, within 2 hours, you can get to the bulk of the inner portion of the PRD, and within 3, you can actually get to a substantial portion of the whole region. Why 3 hours? Once again, most of you know this. 3 hours is a compact economic region. Economic development anywhere in the region helps everywhere in the region. Okay? So this is just within the last couple of years that connectivity has changed. Within the region, we also see a huge amount of cooperation going on within the Guangdong portion. We see Shenzhen, Dongguan, Huizhou doing integrated transportation planning, integrated economic planning, scheduling the orderly movement of lower value activities out of places like Shenzhen and into lower land cost areas of Dongguan and Huizhou. Same thing is happening Guangzhou, Foshan. The transport systems are integrated. Even administration of some border areas is integrated. And those of you in the property sector know that a flat in Foshan, its price depends on its distance from the center of Guangzhou, not its distance from the center of Foshan. Zhaoqing, Zhuhai, Jiangmen, that will follow a bit later as that develops more. So what we see developing here with the connectivity is an inner ring. The inner ring will go from Hong Kong around to Guangzhou and eventually around to Macau. That's where the high-end services, the headquarters, the high-end tech development, the advanced manufacturing, that's where that's going to go. It's already going in, east side in place, west side starting to develop. And then the outlying areas, Huizhou, Zhaoqing, Jiangmen, that's going to be the industrial support, the heavy, the mid-tech industries that actually Guangdong never had because it was a smaller, less affluent agricultural economy until China started to open. And each of the cities has really already taken on a set of activities. Guangzhou, the administrative capital, a province of 100 million people. It's the marketing, the sales, the SOE headquarters center for Guangdong province. Shenzhen is the tech startup and dynamic center for the region. Hong Kong, the international face of the region. Macau, too small to do anything, but has 6 times the gaming revenue of Las Vegas, et cetera, et cetera. This division of labor is already forming, actually more extreme than is the case in the Yangtze River to date. And what we're seeing now, as the region is integrating further, we're seeing a dramatic shift in the industrial markets, backfilling, now providing or starting to provide all the economic activities to support an economy of 70 million people, $1.5 trillion US dollars. We're seeing, in terms of the availability, I spend also a lot of my time with major companies, helping them slice up their activities and then place each activity in the most cost-effective location. The GBA is the only place in the world where you can do this sort of range of activities, everything from the highest of the high to the lowest of the low, in a cost-effective fashion within 3 hours. It's absolutely unique. And in addition, China has doubled down on the GBA's role as an experimental center for further opening. There is a new policy initiative, and again, the key thing is not so much the initiative itself. This document more or less repeats what other documents have said before, but the difference is there's now an administrative structure that runs right to Standing Committee of the Politburo that's overseeing the development. So what's going to influence what the impact of this approach, what the cluster policy will be? Well, it's going to be a number of things. It's going to be the central government's commitment to overcome the traditional competition among cities. In the GBA, the old line is Shenzhen wants to steal business from Hong Kong, Dongguan wants to steal from Shenzhen, and Guangzhou wants to steal from everybody, right? And so the question is, can the government help sort that out? The willingness of the local governments themselves to differentiate and cooperate. And again, in addition, and as the earlier session, some of the questions arose, particularly with regard to Hong Kong and Macau and the rest of the region, to what extent people in the region start viewing their compatriots as us and us, as opposed to us and them. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So let's hear Professor Liu's opinions.
Okay. I'm waiting for my PPT. Oh, thank you. My talk will about the relationship between city clusters and metropolitan areas development in China. So, because I know many people, for many people in this room, this is the first time for you to come to China. So I would like to start from the map of China for you to look at the geography. This is a geography of the very big and populous country that is China. And I would like to say that geography actually matters a lot to look at the economic development in different regions. There is a very famous line which is called as Hu Huanyong line, named after the geographer in 1930s. So you can see that the line divides China into 2 parts, the green part and the yellow part. I have to say that the whole country, nominally, is very large, but it also has a very large population. But only half of the territory is livable. That is the green China. And China is a large country. If you compare China with other comparable large countries in all over the world, you will see that actually the coastal line, compared with the whole area of the country, is relatively short. Only the coastal area in the eastern part of China has the seaports, especially in the southern part of China. And I need to mention one thing that is very important to understand the advantages of different regions of China. That is, in the northern part of China, northern to Tianjin, the seaports in those northern area, during the winter, they are frozen. Which means what? If you have the idea of comparative advantage, and if you know that the seaport transportation is still the cheapest way for international trade, you understand that why investors tend to go to the southern part of China to invest. And you can also understand why in the past, the coastal area of China has much higher economic growth than the inland part of China. And in recent years, there has also been a divergence trend of economic growth in the northern part of China and southern part of China. Southern part of China has much higher economic growth rate compared with the northern part of China. And northern part of China, they also see an outflow of population towards the southern part of China because of two things. One thing is higher income and better job opportunity. And the other reason is, especially for the extremely northern part of China, it's very cold there, so people tend to move to the warmer area for residence, right? So let us also show three figures concerning economic development in China. And this is the first figure I want to show. That is the economic regional distribution of the GDP. The red areas in this figure account for half of the GDP in the total country's GDP. And you can see a high concentration in economic activities in China, especially in the Yangtze River Delta and Pearl River Delta, and also Jing-Jin-Ji area. Okay, Chengdu and Chongqing are also very important. But let us look at the second figure, that is population concentration. You will see what? You will see the regional distribution of population in China is much more scattered than the GDP concentration, which means what? In this country, if you know the institution in China, maybe you know the hukou system, which means we still have a domestic interregional barriers to migration across different regions, right? So, which means what? Which means the concentration of population still lags far behind the economic concentration in China. If you believe that within a country like China, in the future, people will be able to move more and more freely across different regions, you will see what? Those regions in the northern part of China and western part of China, they will move away from their hometowns to the places where they can find better job and higher income. So that's the third figure I would like to show you. Look at that. This is already ongoing in China, which means what? The red part of China in this figure means the residents, long-term residents minus hukou population. It's positive, which means what? In China, everybody has our household registration. In those red regions, especially in Yangtze River Delta and Pearl River Delta, the people living there are actually greater than people registered there. But in the blue part of China, especially in the western part of China and the central part of China, you will see what? They're blue. Blue means what? Many people register there, but actually they don't live and work there. They have already left to the places close to the sea, right? Especially the Yangtze River Delta and Pearl River Delta. So, this concentration of population will still go on in the future regional development. And then, let me show you two figures using the econometrics model in my study. I want to show you two distance matter in shaping the economic geography in China. One is at national level. I will show you the distance to the major seaports in China and how it will affect economic development in regions. And the second one is regional level. I will show you how the distance of a city to the local large city will also affect regional development. Now, the first one. In this figure, I draw two lines. One line, which is in red, is for short-run economic growth, year by year. And the dashed line in blue is for the long-term economic growth for almost 17 years of growth in my study when I did that. And the horizontal axis in this figure represents a city's location, which means the closeness to the major seaports. When I say major seaports, I mean Shanghai or Hong Kong, right, as the two centers of Yangtze River Delta, Pearl River Delta. And the vertical axis is the city-level economic growth. 0 is the reference. Negative means slower. So you will see what? When I move from the major seaports to the inland of China, you will see the growth rate will be lower and lower, and then it will become almost flat. And the second peak of this curve in the region of almost 1,500 kilometers away from the major seaports, which is very close to the location of Chengdu and Chongqing. And then this is the figure for you to look at the relationship between the distance to major large cities in different regions as those local regional central cities and the growth rate of the surrounding medium-sized and small-sized cities. You again see what? If you move far away from the local central cities, your growth rate for those medium-sized and small-sized cities will also be lower. So this means what? This is quite consistent with the maps I have already shown to you. In China, to understand the regional development, the closer you are to the major seaports, The closer you are to the local large cities, the higher the economic growth will be, and you will have better economic opportunities. In my model, I can tell you, for city-level economic development, both distances, one is to the major seaport and the other is distance to the local large cities, will account for 25% of city-level economic growth. In my economic model, using econometrics estimation, when I include all the factors which can explain regional development, the total power of the model is 50%, which means what? Only 2 geography variables can explain half of the model, which can be explained in my econometric model. So maybe you will ask, what is the future for the inland area, right? Do they have also their hope locally? My answer is yes, if you have the idea of comparative advantage. The first idea is to allow still people to move to the places where they can find better job and higher income. One destination is still the coastal area, and the other destination is local large cities like Shanghai, like Chongqing or Wuhan or Chengdu, because those large cities can still develop local industries and services. The second thing is some of the middle provinces, especially along the Yangtze River, like Anhui, like Hubei, they still have advantages to develop seaport transportation or river port transportation-based industries, because the Yangtze River is very important. It's very wide and deep. Could be used as almost like a sea. So the trend is, you can see that the relocated industries from the Yangtze River is moving actually along the Yangtze River to the upstream, like Hubei and Wuhan. And third, industries with unique natural resources can still be developed in the inland area, especially for those agriculture, mining, and tourism industries. But I have to mention one thing which is very important. Agriculture, mining, and natural resources and tourism are those industries where the key factors like land and natural resources will determine the total scale of GDP. So if you want to increase the per capita GDP, you have to move people more away from that industries. Otherwise, their per capita GDP will be constrained by the total number of population. And the fourth point, they can also develop, although I am emphasizing the importance of river transportation and sea transportation, but still there are some industries with very low transportation cost. For example, computer chips. They are very tiny, but with very high value added. They can be transported by plane, and it can be transported by internet. A calling center can also be transported by lines, and a newly developed industry, which is live stream, is also developed in China, in some inland provinces and in the northern part of China. They are also transported by the internet. And the inland area can also develop some industries serving domestic demand. If they don't have very strong scale economy, you don't need to develop all these things in the coastal area, but some can be moved into the inland area. And finally, some of the large cities in the inland area have also very high quality universities to serve their domestic demand. So the final point I want to mention is the core metropolitan areas surrounding Shanghai and Guangzhou and Shenzhen can still be larger in the future to lead the city clusters. Just compare Tokyo area with Shanghai. This is Tokyo area. You can see the radius of the Tokyo metropolitan area can be as long as 50 kilometers, and the longest distance from the center of the Tokyo to the southern part of that area is as long as 80 kilometers far away from the city center. But compared with this, let us look at Shanghai. Shanghai's central area's radius is only 15 to 20 kilometers. But I'm very sorry to say that the local government has already think the Shanghai area is too big. But actually, if you compare Shanghai with Tokyo, it's not that big, right? If we move from the center of Shanghai, where we stand now, to 50 kilometers away, that is already Jiangsu province, right? 80 kilometers away from Shanghai is already Suzhou's central area. So you can see that in this area, there is still a lot of land being green for agriculture. Even within Shanghai, you can see the southern part of Shanghai is almost all green. In number, I can tell you, 1/3 of Shanghai's area, although the housing prices are very expensive here, is still agriculture. Because we still have a very tight regulation on land supply for urban use in the city, right? So for me, in the future, if you want to ask me whether I will vote Jing-Jin-Ji or Yangtze River Delta or the Great Bay Area to be the leading city clusters, I will discuss the advantages of and disadvantages using this table. For Jing-Jin-Ji, I mean, the advantages for this area's development is Beijing has almost the strongest human capital resources in this country. If you count the number of the quality universities in Beijing, no other cities can compete with Beijing. That's because of the history. And they also have a lot of headquarters of the large companies, especially the centrally owned companies and large banks in China. But they also have disadvantages. The most important disadvantage for Jing-Jin-Ji area is they lack rivers. They lack long and big rivers. And as I said, many seaports, northern to Tianjin, actually they are frozen during the winter. This is not good for developing manufacturing. And number three, I want to mention, Beijing is controlling the population growth. It's also a disadvantage for the whole area's development. And for Yangtze River Delta, the most important advantage for this area is we have Yangtze River. Yangtze River is so wide and so deep, so the downstream of Yangtze River can actually be used as a sea, right? The transportation costs are really very cheap in this area, and it's a very huge area. And the population size is also very huge. I would like to say, in modern economic development, population size is not disadvantage, it's actually an advantage for a scale economy. And healthcare and education resources in this area is also very competitive, maybe just next to Beijing. But I also want to mention that Shanghai is also learning from Beijing to control the population size, which is a disadvantage for the development of the Yangtze River Delta. And for the Great Bay Area, the advantages, they have a very strong intercity complementarities, especially between Hong Kong and Shenzhen and Guangzhou. And the innovation in Shenzhen, as you know, is very strong. Maybe it will become the future Silicon Valley in China. And the market institutions in the Great Bay Area is more marketized. So that is also very important in the old country like China, because we have a very strong government for the market intervention. But I also want to mention that the border effects, I mean, actually, between Hong Kong and Shenzhen, actually we have a border there, right? Hong Kong is politically one of the cities in China, but economically they are independent, right? And also between Macau and Zhuhai. So the border effects will be a disadvantage for this area. And they relatively have a weaker education, especially in universities, except Hong Kong. So what is the future? I mean, it largely depends on how Shanghai does. I would like to say that if Shanghai still wants to control the size of the population and the land supply, Shanghai is now already losing our competitiveness, because when we control the population size, the service cost is rising very fast. When we want to control the land supply, the housing price is also going up very fast. So we are losing our competitiveness. If Shanghai awake, I could say Yangtze River Delta will be the strongest. If I would like to vote, I will vote Yangtze River Delta. So it largely depends on how Shanghai does in the future. I would like to say one thing to end my talk, which is Shanghai is now realizing that they are losing competitiveness because of the control. So maybe the turning point is coming, but we still need time to wait and see. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Liu. Before we begin further on this discussion, why do you think we have a talk about super city clusters? Right? When I lived in New York, there was no talk about city clusters of New York, Boston, DC, whatnot. And then in Europe, there's a lot of cities close together. Why are we talking about super city clusters now in China? Professor Enright?
Well, I think it's actually pretty straightforward. If we look, since China started to open, it always acts one part at a time, right? So the initial opening was just, 4 special economic zones, and it was 14 coastal cities, etc. These 3 super city clusters have been the leaders of China's economy, actually since well before the economic opening, and they are looked to as the leaders in terms of economic development, social development, technology development, etc. So that's why there's such a focus on them. Because, and I think correctly, Chinese officials believe if we can optimize the effectiveness, the efficiency, the national and international reach of these 3 areas, that the rest of the country will follow along behind. And it's easier to think about that and try to plan it and program it in 3 areas than it is to try to do it across all of the landmass of China with all of the variations in topography, income levels, etc.
So it's quite China-specific, actually.
Well, I think it's China-specific in that, given the way China works, everything has to be, at minimum, policy allowed and usually policy driven. And in addition, what we do have in China, because again, history, geography, population, we do have a density of cities that we have nowhere else in the world. As I said before, there is nothing else in the world that matches the corridor between Hong Kong and Guangzhou. And similarly, there's nowhere else in the world that matches within 200 square kilometers, 160 million people like we have in the Yangtze River Delta. So it's in part specific to China because of the policy side, but it's also specific to China in terms of opportunity set. There are opportunities to do things within these city clusters in China because of how China operates, because of its stage of development, but also because of the proximity of the cities that may not be possible anywhere else in the world.
I see. Professor Liu, you wrote a book about 大国大城, bigger, large cities, a large country need large cities. I mean, we talk about this super city cluster in Yangtze River Delta. Should we just make it a gigantic Shanghai? What is the difference between super city clusters and a very, very, very large city?
My understanding is the super mega city cluster is a group of cities in area surrounding the core metropolitan area. There is a huge misunderstanding in China that they want to control the size of the core city like Shanghai and Beijing to spread the economic activities away from the center and to the periphery regions, so to make the regions more balanced, developed. But my idea, and if you look at the theory and the empirics of study, you will see that the leading cities should be larger to enjoy both the efficiency for scale economy and also the role to lead the regional development surrounding there. So my understanding is the whole city cluster will grow, but the central area surrounding Shanghai and Shenzhen, Guangzhou also need to grow larger.
I see. Okay, how about we talk about those cities within these clusters? Now I'm brought up in Hong Kong, so my question to Professor Enright would be, if this Great Bay Area really works as this, like right now, let's say in 10 years, will Hong Kong be more like the Chinese mainland cities within the GBA, or the other cities in like Shenzhen or Guangzhou within GBA more like Hong Kong?
Both. And I mean that, because if we look at the history in the GBA, when Hong Kong returned to Chinese administration, its GDP was 3 times that of the 9 Guangdong cities in the GBA combined. In 2017, the 9 cities of the Guangdong cities in the GBA had a combined GDP 3 times that of Hong Kong. So Hong Kong's role in the region has to shift dramatically. It has, and it will continue to do so. And what I tell my friends in Hong Kong is that Hong Kong now has a surrounding economy of a size, sophistication that was never there and was almost never contemplated. And this, to me, is a gold mine, quite literally, because what it does is it provides a massive market right on Hong Kong's doorstep, which Hong Kong never had. But what that means is that Hong Kong needs to transform. It needs to become more integrated in the sense of understanding the different cities of the region better than it does, industries that are growing in the region that maybe never had a history in Hong Kong. BASF recently committed $10 billion to chemical investments in Guangdong. Now, if I'm sitting in Hong Kong and I'm in the financial sector, I need to be thinking, how do I arrange the financing for that, right? How do I do that in terms of the flows? On the other side, we see, particularly in Shenzhen, one of the reasons why Shenzhen has taken off is that through Hong Kong and access to the rest of the world, Shenzhen is really a market pull economy rather than a technology push. And what we're finding is that the other cities in the GBA, as their companies want to internationalize, as they want to improve their service sectors, as actually the cities want to improve their institutions, that Hong Kong is still a touchstone. So the answer to your question is Hong Kong needs to become more like the other cities and more integrated, but the other cities need to be a bit more like Hong Kong if both are going to prosper.
It'll be a very interesting situation.
It will, it will.
We live in Shanghai for so long. What do you think is the biggest challenge Shanghai has in order to grow to be even stronger and greater?
The biggest challenge in Shanghai is many people living in Shanghai, and especially government officials, actually don't understand Shanghai is not a city. It's a group of the central large cities and the surrounding smaller cities. So they would like to compare Shanghai's population and land area with other much smaller cities in Europe and in North America to justify their judgment that Shanghai is too big, and they want to control the size of population and land supply, as I said. The more they want to control, the more they lose. If you look at the first quarter's economic growth in Shanghai, it has already fallen under 6%, right? Which is much lower than the national goal for this year's economic growth. So I think this is the most important challenge for Shanghai as a problem to solve.
I'd actually like to pick up on something Mr. Lo said in the earlier session, and that is Shanghai's not an efficient city. Shanghai is too scattered. It's not dense enough. Shanghai needs not just the financial CBD in Lujiazui. It needs a tighter, denser city center right here. I mean, if you walk up and down Weihai Road or Nanjing Road, you go in 5 kilometers, you look left, right, and half of it should be redeveloped.
I agree.
And then you go out to the transportation hub. We know the transportation hub out at Hangzhou because my company did the land planning for the 86 square kilometer area around that. And what we told Shanghai is that this needs to be a dense CBD for Western Shanghai, which has 8 million people and no CBD. And if Shanghai is going to reach its ambitions of really projecting globally, it's going to need the density that allows a very high performance CBD here, Lujiazui, and out at Hangzhou.
But do you know how Shanghai people think? Shanghai government officials?
Yeah, I know.
They think it is because of population density that cause urban diseases like congestion. So what they are doing is they are regulating toughly the floor-to-area ratio and the height of the buildings and try to scatter the population from the center area to the suburban area. It will lead to more serious congestion issues. But,
exactly.
But they think they're right.
Well, I think whoever developer can succeed in asking the Shanghai Planning Bureau to increase the FAR by, half, 50%, they'll make a bundle, right?
Well, yeah, but the key thing
right.
is that it really has to be, and again, I spend a lot of time working with foreign companies trying to get things done in China. And the key thing is you have to show the value to Shanghai or to China. You really have to show the value. If Shanghai wants to be the global metropolis, then it has to do A, B, and C. And then you go in and you say, you've already made the decision. You want to be global metropolis.
Right.
So therefore, you have to do the following.
Right.
It can work.
Right.
It took us 8 months to do the plan for the Hangzhou area. It took us 12 months to convince the Shanghai government to start it, and they're still not doing it dense enough.
Right. We don't have much time left, but I would like to ask the question. What if these, let's say Yangtze River Delta, Big Bay Area. We didn't even talk about the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei. If these super city clusters succeed, what will be the effect to the economy of Asia Pacific?
Okay, well, as China goes, so goes Asia Pacific. The Beijing-Tianjin corridor, that's been developing for quite some time. And what they are doing now is splitting the manufacturing, the heavy industry to the port in Tianjin and the high-end administrative service technology in Beijing. That's far along. Hebei is a rounding error. Hebei is just where you decentralize stuff to. So that will succeed in that sense because it'll happen. This is, I agree, the Yangtze River Delta has the most potential because it's the largest land area, and if you get the integration within the subclusters and then overcome the historical problem of Shanghai trying to dominate everything, this will be the largest, this will be the most dynamic. The GBA is a tight area, and it has, in the short term, it's the most obvious one because the portions of the economy that will be filled in are obvious. But it also, in some senses, is the most problematic. It's the most export-oriented, internationally oriented, and with 3 different systems in Hong Kong, Macau, and Guangdong, that makes it more problematic.
Professor Liu?
For me, I think if everything is based on market forces, but rather than government intervention, I would like to say that in the future, the Great Bay Area could be the leading manufacturing center plus the innovation center. The Silicon Valley, not only for China, but for the whole Asia, maybe. And Shanghai will be very hopeful to be the financial center and also a cultural center. And for Beijing, maybe mainly an education center and cultural center. That's a very bright future, but, government intervention, who knows?
I think we are already beyond time, so I guess we are not asking questions from the
questions.
Okay, so a round of applause for Professor Liu and Professor Enright.
Thank you.